欢迎收听 Area Ruler 的图书讲座。
에리아 박 토크에 오신 것을 환영합니다.
이리야 루아의 북 토크에 요코소.
Welcome to the Area Ruler Book Talks.
So thank you everyone for joining us today and our conversation about Zhou Shuxian's book, From Forest Farm to Sawmill. And of course, with us today is the author herself. Hi Shuxian, thank you for joining us. Before we start talking about the book, I would like to give a brief introduction about Zhou Shuxian and the book as well. So Zhou Shuxian is a writer, researcher, and community organizer based in Seattle, where she is also at the moment. She graduated from the Central University of Finance and Economics in Beijing with a degree in economics in 2009. She received an MA in feminist studies from University of Washington in Seattle in 2013 and a PhD in feminist studies also from the University of Washington in 2017. She's now an affiliated faculty member in the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Washington, and she works as a policy analyst at the Seattle Office of Labor Standards, and where she kind of is combining her academic and practical interests in topics such as gender, sexuality, diversity studies, cultural anthropology, social movements, and environmental studies. And her goal is to inspire meaningful dialogue and advocate for equity and justice among the diverse communities. She has published several scholarly articles as well as other nonfiction essays. I will just mention just two here, and both of which touch on themes that are also found in her book. So if you don't have the time to read the book, you might start there. So, and I also posted the links in the chat. So the first one is a prize-winning essay, The Posthumous Child, which is basically about her family history, maybe we could say that, which was published on Sixth Tone, which is an online magazine focusing on contemporary China. And secondly, an article titled Suku and Self-Valorization of Chinese Women Workers before, during, and after the enterprise privatization that appeared in Frontiers of History in China in 2015. And you also can learn more about her and her publication and activities by visiting her personal website, which is also in the chat. So before delving into some of the many fascinating issues and themes that the book addresses, I would like to offer like a brief introduction and maybe my impression to give everyone a rough idea of the main questions and content of the book. So the book is based on her dissertation, which was titled The Gendered Landscape of Chinese Forestry Reform, Labor, Narrative, and Resistance, 1950s to current at the University of Washington. And the book itself, it deals with the women in, I would say, in China's state-owned forestry and timber industry near the city of Zhou, which is in Fujian province in southeastern China, and how these women have interacted with state policies over several decades, and how they have been affected by structural differences, mainly between urban and rural areas and between men and women in China. So I think the book provides many very fascinating insights into various issues from the 1950s to the present, from the perspective of female and also some male workers, including the economic transformation that China underwent after the Second World War with the establishment of a socialist regime, its transformation and so-called reform and opening up from state socialism to an increasingly privatized and capitalist economy in the late 1970s, and then to the rapid economic developments after the 1990s. The book focuses on the history of workers and the specific gendered division of labor in socialist China, as men, for instance, in forestry and wood processing often had the privileged status of state workers, whereas women were often family dependents and collective workers. And we are going to talk about that just in a second. So the book also addresses internal migration and the fast perceived and real social and regional differences within Chinese society, which I would argue is often perceived by non-specialists as highly homogeneous. And she shows that that's not the case, of course. Another important aspect that appears throughout the 6 chapters of the book is the history of forests and human-nature interaction. So how rural areas were physically and administratively transformed by the Chinese state into urban industrial space, as a huge state forestry industry was supposed to contribute to the industrialization of China, mainly through the exploitation of labor and natural resources. So, and then there's also, again, the transformation back into what was officially called ecological public welfare forests through reforestation conservation projects. So, which was often put under the slogan of ecological civilization. So I would say, as the book is like a deep immersion study of anthropology, relying heavily on oral interviews and also personal family experiences and relationships. So I would recommend it to anyone looking for a very accessible introduction to gender and women history, as well as labor history in China. And also, it's also very interesting for more advanced readers, I think, who are interested in these and other topics, such as economic and social transformation in China since the late 1970s, and forms of social protest as well, and interaction between people and the state today. So it was really a fascinating read and highly accessible, I think, and also very entertaining. Although there are also, one might say, tragic stories in there, but it was really a very fun read and good read, and it's highly recommended. So, Shuxian, can you maybe tell us a little bit more to begin with about your own academic journey and why you ended up researching and writing a book on this topic? So maybe we could take us through the process of researching and writing the book a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Nicholas, for the invitation to the book talk, also for a very, very nice introduction of me and also the book. And I'm actually really bad at summarizing like my book. I think I'm gonna go back listening to a recording and then try to keep the insights up from you for next time when I need to introduce my own book. So as you said, the book is based on my doctoral dissertation, but my research for this book actually started before that. I started my PhD in 2010, but I started doing the interviews in 2008. So I brought in this research topic into my PhD program. And to some extent, doing the PhD is at that moment the only way I know I can find a way to tell a story. You know, like I grew up in working class family and I would just graduate from undergraduate. There's no other way at that moment. I want to tell a story and I can just stop working, you know, for a few years to interview. So for me, they said, okay, if I do a PhD, then I can learn how to do research properly, and then I can, I find the right research material and do the interviews and collecting all archives, and then I can write this book. And then come back to like why in the beginning I really want to tell this story, and I want to like show some pictures and slides. Let me see. Can you see it like a map?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I also use this map in the book. Basically, this is Sawmill I grew up in. It's in, as what you already said, it's in southeastern China, the Fujian province, in the inland part of Fujian. And then, yeah, don't mind too much of the details of it, but I'm just trying to say that if you see there's a road in the middle of this map, and in the north of the road, and a lot of it's like apartment buildings and clinic. In the south of the road is all the sawmill production area, like warehouses and then finished goods and storage for the woods or different workshops of fiberboard and plywood. And then the next one is showing the detailed part of apartments. So there's not only the apartments for workers and families, but also have canteens, preschool, vocational elementary school, athletic fields, auditorium, and daycare preschool. So just a way to say that, when I grew up in this sawmill, and this is considered as a very typical work unit. And for folks who are familiar with China in 20th century, in the PRC 20th century era, this is the most basic urban planning unit in China. It's centered around the production, but it also takes care of the social production of the workers and families. And I grew up in this place, and then around late 1990s and early 2000, in Zhou, in the place I grew up in, state forest alone, there's about 10,000 people laid off. And then nationwide, there's 25.5 million workers were laid off between 1980 and 2001. So for me, originally, I just feel like, if you look at TV or popular culture, the portrayal of laid off workers are usually just lazy, incompetent, depressive, or they get adapted into the new labor market. They're used to the underpaid, long working hours, no benefits, and then no stability. And that considered as a success, like if you get used to a new market. So for me, like originally, I was just trying to tell different kind of stories of laid off workers and people from my community. And so that's when in 2008, and I started interviewing folks. And this is the sawmill when it's half demolished. And then in 2011, at that time, I already started doing PhD in feminist studies, and then I have more theoretical and methodological background in how to do feminist oral history. And on the picture, you can see it's my grandma. It's like when she is the first person I interviewed in her generation, because I was interviewing the late of generation. Then it's more like my parents' generation, right? And then she's like their parents' generation, the first generation who built it up, the sawmill and the state forestry. So I interviewed her. It was very difficult. Like she seemed to have like 25 minutes of script storytelling of her life. And no matter how I push and asking detailed questions, she will always come back to the 25-minute script. I, yeah, I will not explain like why that's only 25-minute script. That's one of the chapters in the book. But I was just trying to say that recall that moment. It was like in Fuzhou of Fujian, really hot, and I was sitting in the living room, and then because she keeps all the windows closed or having the shades because it's so hot in summer, and there's only one light from the kitchen window come in. So when I use my camera filming her moving in the kitchen, and for me, there's a sudden realization that she is like she's like actually is on a stage and moving, right? And then that's the moment, I think just through the visual really make me start thinking, actually, maybe what I am trying to do or what I should be doing is not only representing various experience of laid-off workers, but really thinking about if I really put their stories and their understanding of the history in the middle, in the center, then how I would understand the Chinese history and economy differently. And that shaped how the book was structured later. So yeah, basically there's just two like fundamental moments impact how I started research and how I did it.
Yeah, I really like that about the book, that you kind of just started, and you really get to know that by reading the book, that you started with this very personal or family history or family experience, and then you really can see how that involves like society and history and all the processes that happened from the late 50s or from the 1950s until today even. So maybe we just talk about methods and research questions later if you have time to more in detail, and maybe we just we continue talking about the different groups that are mentioned in the book, and I think it's really about the different groups of actors and their relationships and conflict, and this includes people who migrated to Fujian from Shandong province. You can say a bit about that and other places, and then the original peasants that already lived in Fujian province, and then the conflict between urban and rural populations, between state workers and their dependents and collective workers. Then there are also new migrants later, I think in the 90s, who also are in conflict with the farmer workers as well as the peasants who live there. And then there is, of course, the huge conflict or relation between men and women, which is quite different and which is, I think, the main topic or theme of your book. And then later, there's also the conflict between different generations. So it's kind of a lot of different groups of actors. And so maybe you can just tell us a little bit more about the most important conflicts and different groups that you write about in the book.
Yeah. I think like of course, when I first read it, it's only because it's my community. But later, the more I study it, and it's like, oh, forestry is so fascinating, forestry and also the wood processing in Chinese context, because it's like somewhat in between rural and urban, in between agricultural and industry, and also because the women, as you said, they were considered as dependent workers. It's like, are you dependents or are you workers? But you're somewhere in between. So there's just very different groups. Maybe starting from the northern migrants into the south part. So most of the workers were migrated between late 1950s to early 1960s from Shandong, but also from Zhejiang to Fujian. And before they were mobilized into this migration, directed into this state mobilized migration, they were peasants, right? They were mobilized into this project either or both because they experience a lot of famine back home, and then there's a lot of poverty, so they want to have a stable job. And second, also because after 1958, China already have the household registration and food permit. Really, when the state telling them you need to move, you got to move. So they moved to the south part, and then what happened in Fujian at that time is along with the land reform, they also collectivized the forest land. So before the collectivization of the forest land, the rural peasants actually, they have the forest, they have the wood, they have accessibility to it. But when it's collectivized, the state-owned forestry industry has the exclusive right to commercialize, to produce from the trees to wood. And then they have the migrants from Shandong into Fujian. And that means the outsiders can do things to the forests, but then the local peasants cannot. They can still use it for their own family. Like, I want to have this log for building my own house, but I cannot really selling it. So there's a lot of conflicts in between the local peasants and then the external. At the time, they were called as workers, but actually, just a couple of years before, they were also peasants too. So that's one of the conflict. Also when they say forestry started building their work unit in this rural land, it's like they are very modernized. And I've some pictures in the book, but just essentially you think about all of the rural houses are still like built with mud or bamboo strips or grass, but then this urban look work unit among the mountain already started having like bricks, and then later have concrete just so early, and they have more electricity, more food, more benefits. It's just very very different contrast in the place.
Yeah, so I think we have to maybe emphasize for everyone that the Chinese state always kind of privileged the urban population, and these peasants from Shandong, they turned into an urban population because they were more important for industrializing the state, right?
Yes. Yeah. So I think that folks who are familiar with China probably know like the urban has more resources and rural has not much resources. But I think what little known is there's this kind of urban look units actually located in the rural land. So just make it a lot more like confrontational and interesting. So that's the worker and the peasants. And for the women in between part is when they when they mobilized workers into the state forestry in Fujian, they moved the men first, and they told them that, oh, you just need to stay here for 2 or 3 years to 支援前线建设, so support the construction of the frontier against Taiwan, because Fujian is across straight from Taiwan. And then they thought they were only here for like 2 to 3 years, but then after 3 years, they're like, oh, sorry, you're gonna stay here forever. But then, to make you, can feel more relaxed and then focus on work here, and you can bring your family here. And if you're not married, you can also go back to your hometown and then, get married and then bring that woman here. And so, on the narrative level, it's like the state doing something really good for the male workers to fulfill their sexual and social needs by bringing their wives here. But actually, when the wives all arrive, and then they immediately became workers, right? So the men were doing the work like fell trees or driving the trucks, but the women were doing a lot of work in peel the barks and getting the land ready for another rounds of planting trees and plant trees and the nurture trees. And the workers telling me is like their understanding is when the men need to work in the mountain for 1 day and the women need to work there for 3 days. It's just because there's so many different kinds of work. But then the women were considered as dependent workers. So they were not paid as like monthly salary, but more like each day, if you work and if you collect 50 kilogram of the barks or the sticks, and then I will pay you 1 day how much money. So then there's that part of a difference too. Right, new workers. So, and then they have, two generation of state workers working there, and then they were laid off around 2000, and then there are still some administrative staff stay there for the state forest farm. But because there's a logging ban in after 2000 because of environmentalism, so they laid off most of the workers, and then the state farm started hiring the new migrants from southwest China, from Yunnan and Guizhou province, and they're just, a new group of workers. And also this group of workers were very different from the older generation of state forest workers, because the state workers have stable housing. Before they were laid off, they have stable housing, a lot of benefits. But then these new migrants, they don't have stable housing. Often they just build their own sheds, or they will find abandoned houses to live in. And of course, they don't have benefits. There's no contract. And there's just a lot of like displacement from here to there, more like the new like capitalism market, workers without stability, contracts, and yeah.
Yeah, so really different kind of migrants in the first generation, really privileged, now urbanized population that is really privileged by the state, and then now or later in this like the later generation, it's really this kind of floating population as we know it, really underprivileged migrants that are kind of fleeing their poor situation in their home province, and then they are really not welcome at all and not supported by anyone basically, but also needed, and but really live in very poor circumstances as compared to the original migrants who are privileged, as you showed in these images in the beginning, where you really have all these whole comforts and whole Danwei support, and you get like basically everything you get as a urban citizen in China at the time. So that's really interesting. And so maybe we can also talk a little bit more about the difference between men and women, which is, I think, the kind of the central issue in the book. So you already mentioned that women were usually, in general, not official state workers. They didn't get like this stable salary. They had to do this kind of more difficult, but not as important work. They also had to do all this kind of other care work and all the other homework, basically. So maybe we can talk a little bit more about the conflicts between men and women, and how the state kind of throughout different decades basically supported like a more patriarchal society, right?
Yeah. So there are two generations of now we are only focusing on the state workers, two generations. And then the first generation is men are considered as workers and women is dependents or dependent workers. And then second generation, men still stay workers. And then the women were titled as collective workers. So, both generation, that's about the same thing. There's a gender division of labor. Often men were doing more. So yeah, now, because before I talk about how the division happened in forest farm, now let me switch a little bit in the sawmill. So for the man part, often they do like like a fix because they work on assembly line to sort of, and then men often work in one position and then get really quote unquote skilled doing that one position. And often the women dependent workers will work in all kinds of ways. Like their major work is to carrying actually really, really heavy the wood products. Sometimes can be logs from the workshops to the trains and trucks. But even that, they were still saying the men are doing more heavier work and women doing lighter work. It's just not true. So they were doing a lot of carrying the wood products kind of work. And whenever there's an opening, somebody gets sick leave and then somewhere on the assembly line and in the workshop, and then the women will be brought in to say, okay, you will substitute here for a few days. So like in my understanding is then I was thinking, oh, the women actually learned to do all kinds of work, but they were paid lower because they were not considered as very skilled and knowledgeable in one position. So that's the first generation. And second generation, and why the women were called collective workers as a like interesting story, because in 1980s, China basically already started switching to the capitalism, and then but on the national narrative level, it's still like the workers are the owner of the factory, and we're still trying to taking care of all the worker families. So the first generation workers now have their children all grow up, right? And then they have often they will have their sons to take over their position. Like the sons take over the position, become the second generation state workers. But then the daughter is still there. And then, so the workers will push the factory owner to say, okay, we want our daughter to also have stable jobs. Because, we build a factory together, we deserve it. But then from the top down, the nationwide policies like state enterprises shouldn't expand. Because now we are more care about the efficiency, economic development, etc. So then the mill managers that we cannot hire more people, but we really have this pressure from the workers. And what they come up with, and also a lot of other state-owned enterprises all come up with is they build this collective, quote unquote, collective-owned enterprise and saying, okay, then we will hire these daughters into the collective enterprises. And the collective enterprises will use the wood waste or scrap wood or the secondary products from the state-owned enterprise. And in the document, they will say they are they are like utilizing the extra labor. They are utilizing the wood waste as if the women, the daughters, and then the wood waste are all just something like it could be waste, and we are trying to reuse them. So same idea, like the state is doing some benefits for the workers' family, but the women are still doing the work, right? So they were hired and they were paid a little bit less, and then like they started doing work until laid off time. The collective women workers were laid off 3 years earlier, and also because they were not paid the Social Security, so they have much less pension. That leads to the whole protest starting from 2014 until very recently.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting about your book that the Chinese state in the 50s and 60s and 70s under Mao really was all about gender equality. And, there's this famous sentence of women own like half of the sky or something like that. And you really see how that's not true, because it's this Chinese state exploits the labor basically of everyone, but more of the women, so to say. They have to work as hard, twice as hard as men, to like basically earn their place, right? So let's talk a bit more about the changes in the night that happened in the late 1970s. So there's this transition, this reform and opening up period in China, starting in the late 70s, where we have like this transition from state economy to private economy, and there are these consequences, the layoffs, you already mentioned it, and the particularly bad treatment of women. Maybe you can take us a bit through the events. You already mentioned some of that. What happened to the forests regarding ownership and management of farms and mills, and what happened to the workers and dependents after the reform and opening in the late 70s, 80s, and then the whole privatization process, right? So
Yeah. I think Chinese economic reform is very interesting. It's really step by step. It's what those like experiments, as what often the slogan says, touching the stone to across the river, or like regardless black cat or white cat, as long as you can catch them, you're a good cat.
yeah.
So there was a lot of experiments, and in the sawmill and in the say forestry, and in 1980s, that's a restructuring of southern forest industry started, and in 1985. And that's the wood market opened. So now the rural peasants can also produce some and then sell the woods. And so there was like different kind of, here you start a little bit, and then I'm doing a little bit here reform. And around in the early 1990s, in these state-owned enterprises, they were doing 集体承包制, so responsibility more. So let me just explain it. Usually it's like each workshop will have a quota to say, this is my goal. This year I'm gonna produce this much and have this this profit. If it's over this certain amount, and then the manager of this workshop or the workers will divide it up, the extra profits, right? They just tried all different kinds of things. In 1997, in the Sawmill too, they tried to say, if we can transform the collective enterprise into a stock-based, like each worker will have some stock and share of enterprise, so we are all sort of owners in the collective or private ownership. They just did all kinds of experiments until 1998, and then there was a sudden in Chinese called 一刀切, it's like clear cut, to say, okay, actually all of the experiments doesn't solve the problem, and then so we will privatize a lot of China privatized like really majority of labor intensive part of the state enterprises. The state still owns the capital intensive kind of enterprises, but like forestry, wood industry, or paper mill, etc., or privatized. So that's when what I said before, the women workers were laid off first, and then the male worker were laid off second. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, mostly. So I mean, it's the important thing is, of course, that these forest mills and the sawmill and the whole forestry industry was privatized, and then you had this kind of process where you ended up having like these private businesses, right? And where workers have now far less share and rights, and they're just less important, and the beneficiaries are private enterprises and business people, right? So
Yeah, can I
letter,
sorry, can I just add one more thing? And I think I didn't mention, but for example, the sawmill, when it was privatized, it was sold to four private wood businesses. That it was sold, basically become from one state sawmill become four privately owned different wood producing factories. And then they didn't hire back many of the state workers. They also started hiring the rural migrants from other parts of Fujian or other parts of China. Yeah, I think the part of it is they started thinking if I hire state workers and then they have this entitlement to the factory because they thought they built it and they contributed to it. So they started hiring the rural migrants too.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how the propaganda, like and you mentioned that in the beginning of the book, and also in the beginning of this conversation, you mentioned that how like the propaganda, so to say, or the narrative in China really was then that people had to contribute to the reform and opening, to the transition to a more private economy, and just by like finding new jobs and doing now really unskilled work. And there are really some very funny stories. They're tragic in a way, but they're also funny. How they try to make a living after that, right? For instance, some of them who played instruments, they founded this funeral band, and then they were like very skilled workers before, and then they had to kind of do music for like at funerals, and that's how they made a living. And they were basically told that it's like they are contributing to building up the country, and with this new kind of work. Yeah, so really, really interesting to see. So I think the final part of your book really is then about like the resistance and like the reactions that happened like the decades later, basically, of the laid off workers. Some of them, or I think most of them, they received like a severance pay. Men more than women, but then there was some more resistance beginning in the I think 2014, when like resistance of these dismissed workers began, especially of women. And you write about their methods and ways of standing up for their rights and demanding compensation and recognition of their life's work, right? So maybe you could talk a little bit and describe their tactics. What then happened from like the 2014 on, I think. And I think very interesting is that you were really involved in that part also, right? Because you already started your research, and then you were really like there most of the time, and really, really, really experienced on the ground what was happening there. So yeah.
Yeah. So I was doing my field work starting in autumn of 2013. And then the protests started happening in the beginning of 2014. There was also like several, I think same as the Chinese economic reform is experiments for the worker resistance, also like experiments. Like they try different techniques. In the very, very beginning is the state workers protested. And then they tried, and then one of them was arrested, and then they didn't feel like they have a good legal background. And then so they stopped it. And then the women collective workers took it up and saying, actually, I think we have a different positionality here because we are collective workers. And then that means legally the assets, the buildings actually owned by us as a collective. Then why, when the government sold our factory, why didn't we get enough money? And instead, we got much less pension. They were only paid like 3,000 yuan, around 3,000 yuan as a severance pay, because they were like collective workers. And then the factory told them that you are not really workers. So the severance pay is very low. And so the workers like, okay, if we are not really state workers and we are collective workers, then we are collective owners of this building, right? And then if you want to sell this land to real estate at this moment, if you want to sell them to the new owners, then give us the land and assets selling money. Either way, right? If you think we are workers, state workers, give us a pension. If you think we are not workers, we are collective owners, then give us the sales. So they did quite a lot of things. They did like line up in front of City Hall and broke into the City Hall and finally met the deputy mayor and also the Forest Bureau manager and pushed them to say they will start an investigation group to figuring out what's the status of the assets. So that's the very beginning in 2014. And then what I think really works is just persistence, that five of them, the leaders, will go to the Forest Bureau or go to a city hall like almost every day. Every afternoon, they would just go there and asking, hey, what do you think about it? What are you doing? You said you started investigation group, and then have you done anything? And then they pushed them enough that they opened the whole archive and checking all the accountants, trying to figure out who owns what and how much assets belong to who. And during that process, I think probably that's the entertaining part of the book. During the process, one of them accidentally, among all of the dusty archive, and they found one of the paper wrote about during the layoff, during the privatization, the owner of the collective factory gave a piece of land that belonged to the collective enterprise to a real estate developer. So they're like, okay, this is totally illegal. If you are not going to solve our problem, then somebody needs to be put into jail for corruption, right? Because you did something illegal. So just all kinds of stuff all piled it up. And they were promised to give 170, I'm trying to, sorry, my number in English is really bad. I think it's 170 million. I don't remember exactly.
I don't remember either.
Yeah. But
quite a
they will
lot.
promise a certain number. Once once the city government sell the land, they will given the certain number of money. But that was in like 2015. Just so early, they were already promised a number, but then in Chinese economy and urban housing price kind of crashed. So the city government cannot sell the land. And then once they can sell the land, they have the money. And then they came back to say, oh, we have to have everybody agree to divide money in a certain way. If you want to divide it by how long you have worked for this enterprise, or if you want to just like you need to figure out, and every 500 of you need to agree, then we will give you money, right? It's a way for the city government to not give them money. But it took a few years for everything to be settled. And actually, when I published book, I still don't know if they got money, but I think maybe half a year after I published the book, each of them get the divided money.
Okay.
So it's like, yeah, it's really good. And
Okay.
it's not that much if you think about 10 years of protesting, right? It's 5 leaders, but like 30 or 40 activists or like working on this kind of stuff and on and off. Yeah.
So, but that's basically how the book ends, right? That there is an agreement and that they are promised like a lot of money. I think it sounded like a lot of money actually, and it wasn't clear if they really get it or not. And there was kind of this legal agreement between the city governments and protesters, right? So, but they received it, so that's good to hear. So
yeah, they received money. Yeah.
So, but maybe just taking a small step back, I think the interesting part also about these 2 chapters or 3 chapters in the book is that how like this protest built it up, or how it built up to these actions, and that they first like what you call knowledge accumulation.
Yeah.
That they were not really aware that they deserve any kind of higher compensation or severance pay, and how they kind of told through these tales of suffering, this suku, right? That they kind of made themselves clear that they are deserve more and that they can demand more compensation. And there was kind of this legal self-education, right? Where they kind of delved into the legal know-how. How they could actually get more money out of the government, right? So that's quite interesting.